Thank you very much. Good afternoon, bonjour, bon après-midi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Isabelle. I'm French originally, but this will be in English. Sorry, but we can talk French at some time if you want. So yeah, I'm here as the Business Governing Board co-chair, whatever that means, a long title. And so I work very closely with the OpenAPI initiative. And the goal really of this section is to kind of set the stage for the rest of that track. What we've done and in cooperation with API Days is to create an OpenAPI or specification track in each of those conferences in which you will hear from now until the end of this afternoon about practitioner people who have done some really interesting things with OpenAPI. And at the end of it, if you're interested, I welcome you to come back and we'll have an open discussion on where we are, how you use it, share experience, what you would like to see in the spec, etc. So we do some community exchange at the end of this session, which is really the goal of this entire day, okay? So, what is OpenAPI, right? So, well, if you're here, you probably know it's an open standard for describing REST APIs, right? We have been working on this for something like 10 years already, so it kind of coincides with the API Days anniversary. It's been originally developed by a single person who then worked for SmartBear. And since 2015, SmartBear donated the specification to the Linux Foundation. And so we are a sub-project of the Linux Foundation, right? And this is when the name change happened. So what used to be called Swagger, you know about Swagger, is OpenAPI. So just to clear all the potential misunderstandings people have about this, right? From a functional point of view, OpenAPI 2 is really the same as Swagger 2.0, right? So the only thing Swagger did is take this and donate it to the specification, to Linux Foundation. Okay, get the next people in. It's great to see everyone. I'm thrilled to see everyone here. So you can see it's one of the top specifications being used between version 2, which is used Swagger still, and OpenAPI version 3, which is really the most recent version we will talk about. Okay? Now, who is supporting this? So you have a lot of logos in here. As my role really is to be managing the group of people who are members of the OpenAPI, supporting member of the OpenAPI initiative. And what is that? Well, it's a number of companies, it can be vendors. As you can see, you're going to recognize a lot of company names from like Microsoft to Google to SAP, etc. Or, of course, you have many, for example, API management solutions there on the show floor who are supporting OpenAPI. But you also see people like eBay or Bloomberg in here. We'll say no new people like No Name or ourselves, 42 Crunch, who are doing security around OpenAPI. So the role of that group really are people, so we basically fund the OpenAPI initiative to support it, okay? So a wide variety here of people across different horizons. If I take eBay as an example, I really like eBay for what they've done for APIs for the past 15 years now. They've been true visionary in what could be done with APIs. Do you know how much money they made through APIs in 2021? Any number? Throw a number. 2 billion, more. That's a bit too much. 20 is too much. 5. Well, you can't play. $5 billion. That was in 2021. Okay? So APIs are really not just about it's really about business, and API is a product. You know, I encourage you to, across this conference, to go and see what can be done with APIs by themselves. Now what can be done with OpenAPI? And this is, you know, I work a lot with OpenAPI as part of my company, which is 42 Crunch. We do a lot around security with OpenAPI. But what started as something that's really for documentation purposes, right? When we started all this, where did it come from? It came from the need to go and document my API so that others could find what they do, how to use them, you know, get documentation on how to consume those APIs. That was kind of the primary driver. But we went much, much further than that in the past 5 to 7 years with a full ecosystem of tools and products around OpenAPI. And maybe you don't know that right now, you don't use it this way, right? But really, okay, of course I can document my APIs, was kind of the document part here, absolutely. But what else can I do? There's a lot of people right now that are using OpenAPI and specifications to do API design first approach, where I start by defining that interface, that contract between the consumers and the producers of the APIs, and kind of everything derives from that, right? The documentation will derive from that, but also the implementation can derive from that, because we can now generate code and implementation both on the server side and on the client side based on a specification, right? I can generate mocks so that I have defined my contract, I can run a mock-up on my API so that both the consumers and the producers can go and work in parallel while we're writing the APIs and the implementation. The people who are going to consume them can write the mobile app or web app which is going to consume that, right? That's testing, of course. There's more and more testing tools that are driven from a specification. It kind of sounds very natural too, because A, you have the definition of every single endpoint and what your API can do. B, you have a definition of all the data which is expected, both inbound and outbound. So I can validate, hey, this is my API, that's the way it behaves. There's a lot of tools now doing, contract testing. Like if I'm consuming that API, does it do, does it answer what it should be, what the contract says, or does it respect what the paper says, basically, right? But also it allows you to make sure, so security is my field, but it's an important thing, but making sure you are not, let's say, returning data you should not be returning. Or your contract says it should return 3 properties, and that's the definition of what the properties are. Do we return more than that? Or we return information which is not in the right format? All of that you can drive automatically through the definition of OpenAPI. And of course, publishing. A lot of the API management tools which are here, for example, will take an OpenAPI definition as an input to automatically deploy an API within their environments, right? So you can really use that as a single language and a single way of having your contract along the API lifecycle. Now, where are all those tools, right? Sorry, before I get into that. The other thing that for me is really critical about OpenAPI is extensibility, right? I have a lot of customers who take advantage of this, because what you do with OpenAPI is you have a static description of what your API does, but you are not locked into what the specification actually gives you. You have this magic X dash something, right, which allows you to extend information on top of the specification. And that gives you a lot of advantages that vendors can take advantage of. Well, I took this example from the API gateway from AWS, right, where you can insert different annotations within your OpenAPI, and when you deploy that, automatically the gateway will consume those extensions and configure the security of your API for you. So what are the key advantages of this, right? As anything which is in code, it's the ability to be automated, something which can be reproduced easily. So if I take this definition and I run it again and again against the API gateway, I'll get the same result again and again, right? I can put this into Git and make a diff between what happened in the last time we deployed this API, what has changed in the definition, right? So it can be, if you are using Kubernetes, right, you have those YAML files which allow you to describe an infrastructure. So think of OpenAPI as a way to describe your API infrastructure if you want, and being able to take advantage of everything a static language allows you to take advantage of, which is this automation, being able to reproduce, being able to track, to version, to roll back, et cetera, right? So the more information you put in there, the more interesting it can be for you than for your own usage. You can do linting. I have a lot of customers, for example, that tell me we're adding our own information in OpenAPI on our own, I would say, requirements from whatever, whatever it is that they want to deploy and show in there, like network zones where this API is going to be deployed. And if that network zone data is in there, then X, Y, and Z will happen as part of the CI/CD pipeline, for example, right? So there's something to, we see a lot of customers also inventing ways of doing what I just said by creating their own framework to actually do that, rather than leveraging a framework that already exists for you that will give you a single language across all the different teams that work across your APIs. It's not only the developers, it's security, it's ops, right? So you can describe all this in a single place. Now, how do you know about all this tooling and those things that I just talked about? So as part of OpenAPI, we've funded a project to create a registry. So every time in that presentation, I'm going to post this right after this talk. You see a link here. You will see, you can go and see this registry. So we've made an intensive a registry of every type of tooling which is available around OpenAPI. And it could be, as I said, parsers. It can be code analysis. It can be converters from OpenAPI and implementation and SDKs. It can be security. It can be linters, et cetera, et cetera. There are tons of both commercials and open source tools that you can take advantage of across the entire ecosystem that I was talking about before. So just go see that registry tooling, and you will be able to get access to all of that. Now, where are we today? So today, the version we have is version 3.1, okay? So version 3.1 has been out for about 18 months now. And the main thing I think we did here is an alignment with the JSON schema. So it's a bit technical here, but for both of you who have been using OpenAPI before, or Swagger, there were some, divergence in behavior between what the standard JSON schema way of doing things was in terms of defining types and things like that. We were like, in some cases, we were supporting a subset of things. In some cases, it was a superset of things. So we got rid of all that, and we align everything. So now you just use this, whatever the standard for JSON schema says is what we apply in OpenAPI. You can declare that in your OpenAPI specification. We'll have it, webhook support. So if you are starting, let's see, that's actually interesting. How many of you here are writing APIs that are using webhooks? Well, quite a few, okay. All right, so this is brand new. It's a brand new block in there that allows you to define webhooks. And then mutual TLS support. So if you have to describe from a security standpoint that you require mutual TLS, that's one of the key things we've been added as well. And again, if you want to learn more, there's the lady who actually created the webhooks, Mauny led the webhooks addition into 3.1, wrote a really good presentation about 3.1 that you can get a lot of details. Now, where are we going next? So when we looked at where we're going next, we basically said, listen, there's a number of things we want to add on top of OpenAPI, but which require some specialization. Like people who are really into field X, Y, and Z, right? And therefore we created this thing called special interest groups. So think of this as like satellite projects around the core OpenAPI definition on a specific topic, right? So we have overlays, workflows, security, SLAs, travel, and finance, where you're going to find more information in here. So let me just take 30 seconds on each of those to explain what those are. So overlays, this is a concept. If you maybe are a MuleSoft customer, you've been using RAML before. In RAML, you have a concept of overlays, which is basically the idea to overlay a part of a specification on top of a main one. So the key use case is I have an API, like 95% of the behavior is the same, but if I'm exposing it to partners, let's say I want to do security in a certain way, if I'm exposing it to the external world, I want to do security another way. So only that security part is different, but all the rest is exactly the same. So the idea of overlays is how do we overlay just that security part on top of the main core API, right? And how do we do that? At very high level, that's kind of the concept, right? Workflows, as the name says, is the ability to describe an API workflow. So this was driven actually by a company doing monitoring who needed to automate how to do an auth dance, as I call it, right? So if you want to do auth, you have to call an endpoint and you get a result, and you have to call another endpoint with some part of that result, etc., etc. How do I describe that interactive, those interactions and the data that flows from one call to the next, right? That's the workflow job. Security, well, as you can imagine, this is like extending to support at the very high level signatures and encryption on top of what we have today. SLAs, this is all about SLAs. How do we describe every single API management in the world can do rate limiting, but we have no way to describe that cleanly in an API documentation, okay? And then we have couple of, so those are more technical, I would say, special interest groups. But we also have a group of people who are from a specific industry and are bringing, I would say, use cases across all the others. Like if I'm in the banking industry, I have some security requirements in terms of signature, for example. The travel guys, as you can imagine, they have requirements on workflows, because what they need to be able to say is, in order to reserve a trip, I need to first get a hotel and then get a car and get a plane, right? For example. So those are, you know, extensions. What will happen with those is, as they get adopted, they may merge into the main OpenAPI specification or not. We're not at that point yet. They're all like work in progress. And again, we need your help and input. And the next thing we're working on is version 4. We needed a cool name, so we called it Project Moonwalk. It's like the Android stuff, you know. Yeah, OpenAPI, it lost a bit of its swag when we lost that swagger name. So that's the Moonwalk thing. So breaking change, frankly, it's very different. It's taking advantage of everything we learned in the past 10 years on what OpenAPI is, on how you're actually using it. So I'm not going to get into the details of that. There's an entire GitHub repository with a proposal with the infamous pet store in version 4. So you can go and have a look at what it actually looks like. And that takes me to my last point, which is get engaged. So those people that I mentioned before, our supporting members, they're really just people supporting us. That doesn't mean they're the one driving the definition, by no means, okay? So you do not have to belong to any of the companies that I mentioned before to come and voice and help and engage with us on the specification, okay? So we have a full community. Go and look at those SIGs. We need help on each of those special groups. If you have some use cases around those overlays, around workflows, around security, come bring them. That's how we make the specification richer, is by getting some real use cases that we can describe using the specification, okay? Participate in calls so that we discuss every Thursday about the specification. This is, again, open to all, so come in. And let's start today, as I said, at 5 today. We'll come back here, and I'll answer all the questions you want at that point, and hopefully we start a discussion on how you use the specification and where we're taking it, okay? And that's what I had for you today. I'm gonna leave you for the rest of the track with key speakers who are going to tell you everything about what they do with the specification. And I'll see you again at 5 for whoever is gonna come back. Thank you very much.